Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. My name is Daniel Nikbakht. We're going to have a discussion today on the crisis in Egypt in Dodd's Auditorium, a place that has hosted many lecturers from scholars, experts, and diplomats, and even a few heads of state. And we're joined by two gentlemen who are no strangers to this room. First of which is Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, a current professor here at the Woodrow Wilson School, and also very dedicated to his students and community here. And also William Wagner, a current MPA student and a fellow in the Scholars in the Nation's Service program. So the topic today is the crisis in Egypt, and the former ambassador to Egypt, Daniel Kurtzer, thank you so much for joining me. Today, the crisis before us came to us in many ways as a surprise. Some people believe that it wasn't, that this was predictable. Where do you stand in this debate?
Well, we knew for many years that we were sitting on a simmering cauldron of discontent in Egypt, a society with authoritarian leadership, very severe and persistent economic problems, few outlets for political, social, economic activity, and a real undercurrent of Islamist unrest over the years. What one didn't know is that this would at some point boil over. One could have imagined circumstances that might have precipitated it, but in fact, if you look back to January 25th, there really wasn't a single match that lit this fire. It just seemed to happen that crowds gathered, perhaps taking a cue from what happened in Tunisia, and then it seemed to grow over time. So yes, we knew that there was a problem in Egypt, but no, I don't think anyone would have predicted what happened.
Well, if you're a professor now and before you were a diplomat, let's merge those careers together. What grade would you give President Obama for his handling of this crisis?
Well, if I look back at the whole course of the crisis, I think the president did well. On any particular day, there were missteps and there were false starts and zigzags in how we were approaching these issues. The president was trying to balance two contradictory sets of American interests. On the one hand, being responsive to our own democracy and our interest in promoting democracy around the world, the president wanted to reach out to the demonstrators and show our support for expanding freedom. On the other hand, we've had a 30-year relationship with Egypt, which has provided very significant benefits to the United States, real strategic benefits, and the president clearly did not want to dump them overboard in a kind of enthusiasm for what was happening on the streets. So there was a little bit of back and forth, toing and froing, but at the end of the day, I think the president got it about as right as he could have.
What does it mean to be an American ally in the Middle East today in a post-Mubarak world? Has anything changed? What is the role now of an American diplomat who may have to speak with a representative of the Saudi government or the Jordanian government? What would you tell them? Why don't we start with you, Ambassador?
Well, I think it's exponentially harder now, both for American allies in this region as well as for American diplomats. In the case of the diplomats, WikiLeaks, the Palestine Papers, have made it very challenging just to do business, to get the kind of trust that one would expect from one's interlocutors. And diplomacy depends on that kind of trust. Secondly, from the perspective of the diplomats, it also requires that the United States act with the kind of power, but also with the wisdom that we have shown in the past. And I think there are questions about some of our policies that even our own foreign policy community is raising. The degree to which we have not made any progress in the Middle East peace process, for example, or the situation in Iraq and in Afghanistan. From the perspective of our allies, many of whom have relied upon this alliance with the United States, it's a very challenging time because together with that reliance goes a responsibility that now their own populations are calling into question. Has it been as good for the people of Egypt that the government of Egypt has been tied to the United States? A case can be made that the answer is yes, but it's not an easy case to make.
I see. Will, where do you stand on that issue?
Well, I'll defer to Ambassador Kurtzer's advice on diplomats, but and what diplomats should be doing. But I will say that among young people, especially in Cairo and university students, bloggers whom I met with while doing research in Cairo always expressed a tremendous amount of respect for the ideals that they perceive the United States as representing. Free government without corruption, greater and equal economic opportunities, but often felt that the US government wasn't living up to those ideals in the region. So I would say that I think an important thing for the United States to keep in mind is that we're fortunate in that yet these protests have not been anti-American primarily, and I think we should just keep in mind that the ideals that many of the protesters leading these movements espouse, especially in Egypt, are not all that different from things we would want here, and so I think we just need to keep that in mind and show respect for that.
We've heard of the Army, the role of the Army, and there's a debate about what this really means. There's the question of transition now from a military to a more civil government. And we also understand that the Army has an economic incentive to see to it that the status quo socioeconomically perhaps remains the same. What are the kinds of things that the Army has to do to ensure that transition takes place? In many ways, what would your advice be if you were called to answer? Why don't we start with Will?
I think I think one encouraging thing about the direction of the protests in Egypt in particular is that the military does seem to have embraced a role for itself as defending the country and restoring order, but also working with the protesters and in particular inviting representatives from many different factions of the protesters, from young secularists all the way through to the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think that the military so far has seemed, to really take on a great deal of respect for the protesters, which has been a very encouraging sign. I think the difficulty is that the military does have a lot of powerful economic interests in pretty much every economic sector within Egypt. They have interests in bottled water, baking bread, tourism, tremendous amount of economic privileges that they amassed in large part because of their connection to their close connection to President Mubarak. So I think what we're going to need to watch out for is whether the protesters demand an end to those privileges, and whether the military will be able to maintain sort of common interests with the protesters if the protesters start to challenge some of those economic perks that they've amassed. But for now, the military seems to be playing a constructive role.
And if you could follow up on that point, and also to our viewers, can you help us understand how this army is structured?
Well, the Army since 1952, since the revolution that overthrew the monarchy, has seen itself as the embodiment of the legitimacy of the state and as a classic Praetorian Guard, sitting in a sense behind the throne, supporting those who sit on the throne, and in fact, until now, providing the person on the throne who would take off a uniform to become president of the country. So this is not just an army that has proved to be loyal. This is an army that very much sees itself as identified with what modern Egypt is. I think Will has captured quite well the dilemmas that face the army in the period ahead. On the one hand, whether or not to actually yield not just economic power, but also political power. There are younger senior officers within the ranks who wonder whether this is not a 1952 moment for them. In other words, not simply handing over power to some civilians, but becoming civilians themselves and taking power that now is available to them. Or whether or not this army will be content with protecting an economic stake in society, but also creating space for political activism. Mm-hmm. There are essentially three components of this army to watch. Number one are the most senior officers. We've seen a picture of this military council that is now the acting government of the state. The acting prime minister is the former chief of the Air Force. The acting head of state is the Minister of Defense, Marshal Tantawi. We've seen pictures of them, but this constitutes two groups. Kind of the older, ready-to-retire group, but there's also some young and hungry senior officers in that first category. There's also a rising level of officers from lieutenant to colonel, who can begin to taste the perks of power and economic benefit, but haven't quite gotten there yet. Which way will they go? Will they go with the more youthful opponents of the old regime, or will they go with their own futures? And then you have the conscripts. Virtually every Egyptian serves in the army. The army certainly doesn't want to test the loyalty of these conscripts with respect to asking them to fire on a crowd, but one doesn't know how the conscripts would act in a situation of crisis.
Where do you stand, Will, on this debate? Some people say this may be 1979, this is 1989, or is this a separate case that people, let's say in academia or policymakers, should understand is distinct from historical precedents?
Well, I'll preface this by saying I'm no academic expert on revolutions, but I think what's important, what seems distinct in my mind about the way what's playing out here, is that for the most part, this movement didn't have a strong single leader that took out Mubarak. It didn't have necessarily a comprehensive platform of demands other than Mubarak's exit. It was a sort of very organically, composed group coming together using an unprecedented array of, again, new media tools in an environment where messages were being conveyed around the region in a way that doesn't seem immediately to be parallel to previous instances of revolution. I will say that I don't think that I think it's pretty clear that what we're seeing in Egypt doesn't resemble Iran in 1979 at the moment. Though Ambassador Kurtzer is absolutely correct that we need to be cautious about the Muslim Brotherhood and where they're going, they weren't at the forefront of these protests, and the protests were not religiously driven, nor were they driven by concerns about Western attitudes in the region. So I think that's a very important distinction to make in looking at historical examples.
I think many people out there, both Americans and even academics and policymakers, have this one really simple question. Perhaps a very complex answer comes along with it. Can the Muslim Brotherhood be a trusted partner for which the United States can work with?
Look, the organization has a long history, and it has a single goal. Its long history started in 1928, and its single goal is the creation of an Islamist state in Egypt. It has been tactically flexible, but it's also been the organization through which all of the ideological, intellectual foundations of what we know today as Islamism, both in its so-called moderate form, but also in its militant form, have emanated. And in that respect, I think one has to put the onus for proving acceptability and moderation on the Muslim Brotherhood itself. If it truly wants to be a part of a society in which liberal values and the kinds of protections of freedoms are going to be ingrained, then it's going to have to do a very fast and good job of convincing people that that's the case, and that it is not simply becoming a kind of fifth column within the political space that's being created by the military.